thank you, first of all, for inviting me to the University of Copenhagen for this lecture. I'm very happy to be lecturing in front of your students, although remotely. My name is Codruţa Sîntionean. I teach Korean studies at the University of at Babeş-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca, Romania. We have the largest Korean studies program in the country. And I have been developing it since 2008 when we started. Today, my lecture is entitled The Making of National Heroes During the Park Chung Hee Era. It's a bit of a broad title, promising perhaps too much for the time that I have allotted, I have today. But let's hope that I will make an introduction into the practices concerning heritage management during the Park Chung Hee era, particularly practices related to the selection of national heroes. Now, what I'm basically saying through this lecture is that during the 1960s and the 1970s, the government started to select a list of national heroes or historical figures that the government then presented as national heroes. And the selection itself was a process reflecting the objectives of the era, mostly modernization and conveying to the citizens a sense of national unity through a shared past. But this selection of national heroes went further than that. It tried to persuade citizens to participate actively, loyally in state projects. And we all know this is an era in which economic development was the main objective of the state. For President Park Chung Hee, actually, history, heritage, culture, and the arts had great educational and political value and had to contribute to the development of the state. This view explains the enormous investment in culture during the Park regime and the particular insistence on tradition and the past as the quintessential sources of national identity. Now, in order to illustrate these ideas, I would like to start with a short story. In 1975, in October, the president participated in the inauguration of a highway and used the occasion to visit Ojukon, which is the ancestral home of Confucius scholar Yulgo and his mother Shin Saimdang. The archives of the here's a photograph of how the place looked like. It looks like a regular village in rural Korea. The archives of the Office of Cultural Properties, which was the institution managing heritage at the time, the archives include the president's personal notes he made that day, containing detailed instructions on how to proceed with the alteration of the site in a manner that properly reflected what in the era was called the spirit of the sage. I will show you some of the president's sketches. This is one of them. The evidence shows that President Park Chung Hee explicitly ordered that Ojukon be spatially and narratively recreated in a way that represented Yulgo as a savior of the nation. It's quite interesting because he was a Confucian scholar and a philosopher. So the president suggested that actually the accent should be moved to an essay written by Ulgok, in which he advocated the preparation of a large army in preparation for what would be the Indian War. So Ulgok actually wrote a letter to the throne, trying to ask the king to prepare a large army in case the Japanese would attack, which actually happened. And President Park Chung Hee claimed that this shows that Ulgok, although a philosopher who had probably never fought himself or practiced with the sword, Ulgok should be presented as a military hero, or in any case, somebody with a military strategy, strong military strategy. Now, this is the narrative that was supposed to be incorporated in Ojukon. But what the archives are showing is also an insistence on space and how the spirit of this particular hero should be presented to the public. And the sketch you are seeing here, I hope you can see my mouse moving along the screen.
Yeah.
All right. This is the main road. And then the sketch, this is the president's own sketch. The sketch suggested that from the main road, there should be an access road that should be paved. And so not dirt roads, like most of the roads in the rural area. Then this should be the entire complex, so to say, in which the actual home, the actual hanok, so to say, is located here. But you can see there's a larger ground that was supposed to surround it. Now, the next sketch is going to show you only this smaller part, right? And you can see here a list of the notes the president himself made on 14 October 1975. And what he's saying is that the landscape architecture should be changed completely in order to create terraces or a way of moving upwards towards the main focus of the place, of the historic site. And so people were supposed to climb stairs and then reach the historical buildings themselves. Now, the whole point of climbing was to have in front of any visitor a magnificent view in which the focus would be a large building in historical or traditional style. Now, we might wonder whether the main focus of this view, magnificent view, was any of the old original buildings in the compound. The answer, unfortunately, is no. This is the original building, so the Ojukon, the building that gives the name to the site, but actually what the visitors would have in front of their eyes while climbing was a new building located here. And I will show you how this sketch and his instructions were put into practice. Take a look at the before picture. And now brace for impact. This is the after. You see, so here's the access road, okay, to the right of the picture. And the most of the space that was previously occupied by a rural landscape, so commoner houses, peasant peasant houses and rice paddies was confiscated by, bought by the state from the peasants and then transformed into parking lots and facilities for tourists, such as toilets, ticket booths, places to buy souvenirs, and so on. And then, as the sketch showed, they were supposed to climb into an adjoining courtyard and then again climb to the right. And then here would be the historical buildings. Now, you can, this is a larger view. This is the access road, the first courtyard going upwards to a second courtyard, and again going upwards to the historical buildings. You can see that actually his sketch was put into practice quite literally. This is the historical building, Ojukon itself, which gives the name to the site, to the entire compound. And this is the main building that was erected particularly for this occasion, Munsongsa, which is the main view as the visitors climb. And then here is an empty lot in which previously there was a historical building commemorating the visit of a king in 1788, but it was quite small, and the president said it's too small and shabby, so it should be destroyed and replaced with something more magnificent, which they didn't manage to do, so it was rebuilt only in the 1980s. But in any case, it was demolished. Here is an image of the museum or memorial house, better said, and it's striking that it's white. And you might rightly ask yourselves why. The answer is it's made of concrete. So you can see that the form, the architectural form, is traditional, in what I will later explain how this notion of tradition was selected. But actually the material used was concrete. Here's another one, just a gate, a passing gate. And most of the gates erected at historic sites in the 70s were made in the same fashion. They were white because they were made of concrete. And later on, they were painted. And very few have been replaced, actually. So, yeah, before I go, today they would look like this. And they were painted over. So if you visit Korea, for curiosity in a historic, if you visit historic sites in Korea, just knock on these pillars and check if they are made of wood or concrete. And chances are, if they were made during the 70s, 60s, late 60s and 70s, they were made of concrete for many reasons. What I claim is one of the main reasons was actually ideological, because the state tried to express the past and traditional values through modern means, and this included modern materials. Another reason was the lack of wood. There were many construction sites during the 70s all over the country, and so the government needed large pieces of wood elsewhere. And so these mundane constructions, such as just passing gates, were made of concrete for necessity reasons. Now, take a look at the offices of the just taking care of the entire complex. The offices were often built in a modern style architecture, just again to combine these two elements, tradition and modernity, and express the new face of Korea, something that had a rich heritage and a rich, a very long history, but also was heading towards modernity and economic development. And lastly, the places such as Ojukon came accompanied with festivals and other actually newly invented traditions, newly invented practices in which the spirit of the heroes was commemorated by the public. What is interesting in these practices is that the government gradually took control over these practices. If they were local practices or local commemoration practices performed by family members, descendants of Yulgok or other historical figures, then the state took over and gradually started to send ministries and officials from the Ministry of Culture to actually participate in these commemoration practices as if they were family members. And they did this either by replacing the actual descendants or by performing the rituals and the commemoration practices along together with the actual descendants. And this is important. Basically, the state is saying that it manifested itself not simply as an inheritor of the past and of traditions, but also as an owner of the past and its traditions, with the authority to invent, revive, delete, revise, and select traditions as it saw fit. Now, this is my starting story. Here's a final view of Ojukon as it looks today. What you can notice is that the landscape architecture has remained mostly the same. We have the same landscape architecture in gradually climbing towards this Munseongsang, which was built in 1976. So the way that places such as Ojukon changed in the 1970s has had a very big impact on how historic sites look today, still look today in South Korea. Now, this is simply an example of the so-called restoration practices that took place in the late 1960s and particularly in the 1970s. And they were also called repair and restoration projects, or Hosu Pogwon Sao, but they were actually called purification or cleaning up projects, Jongwa Sao. This is the more common name. The Office of Cultural Properties had a very precarious understanding of the principle of architectural heritage restoration and conservation in the 1960s and 1970s. None of these principles, such as minimal intervention, protection of the original fabric, unaltered preservation of the structure, respect for the original condition of the building. So none of these principles were actually applied at the time. The terminology used in the documents of the Office of Cultural Properties and in the media at the time is very telling in this respect. Commonly, these restoration projects were called purification projects. the new buildings or the partly recreated, purified ones made use of architectural features perceived as traditional, instituting a sanitized version of a purely Korean identity. So here is my claim that actually the state proceeded to select lists of historical figures and heroes, national heroes, to embody national identity, and then started to present them in forms, particularly architectural forms, that represented, again, a sanitized version of tradition, so, or a sanitized version of Koreanness. And further on, I will give more examples of this. Furthermore, these restoration practices were called sacralization projects. And again, the name is very telling. Basically, the term Sîntionean means transformation in a sanctuary. And this suggests that the tourists should treat these historic sites as if they were sacred grounds. And they actually received, in some places, the visitors actually received brochures with explanation on how to behave at these places. And they were told to behave as worshippers, paying respect to the spirit of the sages, to the ancestors, as if they were sacred people, and hence the name of these projects, sacralization projects. Now, what I've been mentioning the fact that most of these projects took place in the 1970s, but actually the prototype for this was the remaking of Sîntionean, which is the historic site. In the beginning was one of several historic sites commemorating Admiral Lee Sun-shin, but it became, thanks to the input of President Park Chung Hee, it became the main place commemorating Lee Sun-shin, possibly because it was one of the closest, or maybe perhaps even the closest one in connection to Seoul, to the capital. And so the president envisioned large number of visitors going there every year, since he himself visited Sîntionean every year in the 1960s. And so it was necessary to be close to Seoul. The remaking of the site was essentially designed by Park Chung Hee himself in the 4 visits he paid in 1968. And he sent punctual lists of changes to the Ministry of Culture and Information for the Office of Cultural Properties to follow through. The level of detail the president paid attention is actually striking. He started by ordering the cutting of grass and the removal of natural stones from the garden at Sîntionean, and continued by choosing which trees should be conserved, the large trees, which should be removed, the scrubs, and because they didn't look impressive and they looked a bit messy, and what species of trees should be planted, like cedars, because they were tall. And in a moment, you will see pictures of how the trees themselves were changed. All the trees from other places were brought in to replace the smaller trees originally located at Sîntionean. And the point was to create a magnificent scenery along the main road leading to the altar. And this road was called the Worship Road, Chambero. Moreover, Park Chung Hee urged the Office of Cultural Properties to cosmeticize the area beyond the walls of the site by restricting the presence of residential houses and and here I quote, choosing crops of scenic beauty. So if there were to be rice paddies or whatever crops surrounding the historic site, they should be beautiful. So choose wisely. Um, his wording, the president's wording, he used words like remove, demolish, move, rebuild. His wording is very suggestive of the radical alterations and that transformed the site and reveals a lack of interest in the actual preservation of historic heritage in its original state. Um, and I will show you a few photographs from Heungcheongsa. Here's how it looked at the beginning. It's not a very clear picture, but you can see the village, again, a rural community surrounding the site, and then a dirt road and rice paddies. Here's a better picture showing you the dirt road and the rice paddies. But then if you take a look at a little bit of how the time frame I included in writing, just a year later, the landscape architecture was completely transformed. And you can see again the terraces that were created in order to make visitors climb towards a selected focus point. Again, a year later from the start of the project, you can see that most of the houses, the rural houses, disappeared. The village was demolished completely. The president had this idea that commoner houses look very backwards and do not represent properly the image of modern Korea. So they should be removed. And so people were forced to sell their houses to the government and then move. The same happened with the land. And again, also Heungcheongsa was a private property belonging to descendants of Lee Sun-shin. It was bought by the state and transformed. So here the houses have, all of the rural houses have disappeared. Just 1 month before, you could still see thatched roofed houses. Here's a look from the up the hill downwards. Just a rural community with thatched roofed houses and dirt roads, but they all had to disappear and make room for a very large complex. Here would be the entrance gate, and then you can see how much space was freed for this historic site in order to create large landscapes and a more impressive atmosphere. Here is how the site looked in 1975. There's no trace of any former rural community. Again, it's very impressive how this particular building evolved through the time. This was the reliquary, preserving some of Lee Sun-shin's personal objects. And at the beginning of the 60s, it looked too modest in Park Chung Hee's opinion. So it had to be enlarged and changed. So it was, you can see that the columns were added and then more detail for the roof. And this resembles actually Buddhist architecture and also some elements of royal architecture from the palaces. And then in one of his visits, Park Chung Hee was displeased with how small this reliquary looked. So he ordered a modern building, which looked like this. And then he realized this is not well harmonious with the rest of the traditional, so-called traditional buildings. So he had it changed, but not removed or replaced. This is how it was changed. They added columns, which again were made of concrete, and the so-called traditional roof. And then they, as I said earlier, they replaced the trees with older trees brought from somewhere else to create a sense of historical atmosphere, as if it were missing, if not for these remade buildings and remade landscape architecture. And here's a photograph of the president in one of his many visits. He liked to embody, so to say, the spirit of Sîncionean and practice archery himself here. Although apparently it's very unlikely that Sîncionean practiced archery here, because he lived at Gyeongchungsa only during his childhood years. So it's quite unlikely that there was a tradition of archery and an archery field when Sîncionean was here. But regardless, there is an archery field today, thanks to the changes made during the Park Chung Hee era. Here's another one. Yes, and another one. He was always surrounded by press, and all these visits were widely reported in the media at the time. Park's imperative to change everything to modern style buildings, except the main historical buildings, would be in later years invalidated by his other directives, and modern style buildings would eventually receive alternative facades and roofs, expressing a perceived Koreanness and traditional flavor. The constant change in instructions indicates that the Gyeongchungsa purification project was a process of trial and error, an experiment with architectural forms and landscape architecture. But this experiment would become the prototype for all purification projects later on. So whatever happened in the 1970s was based on this experience from Gyeongchungsa. And again, the idea was that the state selected Sîncionean and then proceeded to present a certain image of him as if he were the expression of tradition itself. And this was expressed, of course, through other means as well. It was expressed through architecture, and of course through other means as well, such as museum displays and the selection of artifacts that were displayed in memorial houses. But what the visitor first took in was this sanitized image of tradition expressed through a certain landscape. And here's how it looks today. So again, almost everything that was created during the Park Chung Hee era was preserved until today. Now, based on this prototype, there were other sites which underwent restoration, and I will give you just a few examples, and even so, it's a lot of information to take in. But just keep in mind that in the 70s, witnessed a large number of similar projects, including fortresses and battlefields, actually, former battlefields, in which some of the fortresses were completely rebuilt. And some examples include Naman, Sansang, Henju, Suwon, the Seoul City Wall, and so on. Tombs dedicated to the heroic soldiers who died in the Injin War, and I will show you a couple of examples. All of these are connected to battles and the spirit of people who fought for their country. So the value expressed in these places was a patriotism, loyalty to one's country, and most of all, the ability or the, I don't know, the readiness to sacrifice oneself for one's country. And the president urged in his public speeches, urged citizens to embody these values in their everyday lives. How? Well, they were not if attacked by North Korea, and there, of course, this was part of the discourse. The citizens should be prepared to fight for their country, but most of all, they should embody this fighting spirit in their everyday work life by sacrificing themselves at the workplace and sacrifice civil liberties and their comfort for the developmentalist projects of the state. So work hard, without complaining, without protesting against the state, and sacrifice oneself for its projects. Again, other sites which underwent restorations were patriotic defenders of the country from all ages. Now, there was a certain insistence on Shila, and the idea was that Shila was the kingdom which unified the three states. And so there was an implicit comparison between Shila, unified Shila, and South Korea. Just as Shila had managed to unify the peninsula, so would eventually South Korea manage to do the same, reunify the peninsula. And in this sense, the president had often explained his point of view by saying things such as, no one can deny the fact that the legitimate national identity belongs to us in the Republic of Korea. So yes, North Koreans are also Koreans and they share some past, but in terms of who represents this past, it is us in the South who do so. And so we should take better care of how we learn about this past and how we apply the values that we learn from history in our everyday life. And going back, there were other heroes from Koro as well, from Joseon as well. There was very little insistence on colonial heroes. I included here just two examples, Yoon Pong-gil and Yoo Kwon-sun. Maybe I can go back to this idea later on. Maybe you would be interested in the Q&A session on why there were very few colonial heroes that were included in this list. And then there were also places commemorating Korean sages promoted as patriots. Not included here, but very prominent, King Sejong was glorified started to be glorified as a national hero during this period, more so than ever before. And then Lee Hwang, philosopher Lee Hwang, and again, Yul Gok. Now, just a few things about how these purification projects took place. The phrase purification projects encompasses a wide variety of interconnected practices, such as the construction with modern materials, such as cement, of buildings imitating the architecture of the past, or the reconstruction of lost heritage, such as former fortresses, which were long gone. the refashioning of old vestiges in grandiose projects, landscape architecture, and the erection of majestic monuments dedicated to selected figures of the past. One example is this a huge monument at Hangzhou Fortress. Again, the fortress was partly rebuilt, and then in order to see this monument, you were supposed to climb up a hill. And then on top of the hill, there was this very tall victory monument. So the so-called worshippers, the visitors, were always supposed to look up and pay their respect in a almost religious manner. Demolition and forcible removal of displeasing architecture was just as powerful a tool as the construction of new spaces, because these were essential practices in the designation of so-called traditional architectural features. And when I talk about demolition of displeasing architecture, I'm referring, of course, to, I'm sorry for going forward so quickly. I'm referring to rural architecture mostly. So houses such as this one, which were removed completely. And then where rural communities were allowed to coexist next to historic sites, they were forced to modernize. Here's a view of a traditional, just unmodified rural landscape. And then you can see the same village modernized. You can see the before and after. The villagers were forced to replace the roofs of their houses with zinc ones, so metal ones, which looked colorful. And this was a part of the Semaulundong, the New Village movement, that basically transformed how the rural communities looked throughout the country. And here are people just replacing their their roofs. Villages who did so entirely, such as this one, were praised in the media as examples, as positive examples for the others to follow. Okay, and going back just a little bit, yes, another example of this landscape architecture is the tomb of the 700 martyrs, which died during the Imjin War. And you can see that, again, the space goes upwards, and the tomb itself is located here. So this is the final point, but you are supposed to climb many rows of stairs to reach that point. And then this is the one of the buildings newly erected at the tomb of the 700 martyrs. Again, you can notice how slightly wide it is because of it's built of cement. And then at the same time, the architecture reflects a Buddhist temple. The roof was had the same shape as the roof of one of the buildings in Gyeongbokgung, the royal palace. And this preference was expressed directly by President Park Chung Hee, who said, "This is the Korean roof." So again, if we think about rural houses with the thatched roof, that was not Korean enough. That was so un-Korean and so backwards that they had to disappear. But you can see that when erecting new buildings to embody the spirit of national heroes, the state chose even certain elements of architecture. So it didn't choose only the people, what values to express through them, but also in what forms, in what material forms to convey them to the public. And here, if you think about it, if the roof is royal or of royal origin or associated with royal architecture, and many of the details, the columns and the details under the roof are associated with Buddhist architecture. This is the architecture of the social elite. The Buddhist temples were during most of Buddhist history in Korea were supported, sponsored, built by the aristocracy. And so elite architecture became the traditional architecture of Korea. This was Korean, or expressed the values of Koreanness proper for national heroes. Okay, and these details is what I'm referring to, but they were reconstructed in white concrete. And towards the end of the 1970s, members of the Office of Cultural Properties actually realized that there were side effects to what they called zeal of worshiping ancestors. So they realized they had overdone it, and to the, again, regional love of one's native place, end of quote, driving massive restoration projects. So this misconstrued understanding of patriotism had led to, and again, I quote from a prominent heritage manager of the time, Chung Hee. He said that making excessive restorations on a grand scale for no good reason and creating vestiges with monotonously identical shape had taken place. And he was critical. This is an article from 1977. So he is critical of what was happening, but at the same time, some of the same heritage managers praised the enlargement of the territory surrounding heritage sites, the improvement of the landscape, the stimulation of citizens' interest in history and heritage, and the education of patriotism through the purification project. So they would claim that this is the positive aspect of this complete overhaul of historic sites, of selected historic sites again. Others find it regrettable today that there was an overemphasis, which is very clear, on the treatment of military heroes and the heritage dedicated to them, which resulted in the neglect of other historical figures. And this is quite evident. Again, it is evident that there's no consensual view of this era in the history of Korean heritage management. The sites that underwent major transformations during the Park regime are the products of the modernization period, perhaps even more than they are the inheritance of a distant past. These projects actually show that the purification of Gyeongchungsa was a model that was easy to replicate. And the Office of Cultural Properties universally applied the features of sacralization projects described so far. This resulted in a profound uniformization of landscape architecture and heritage sites across the country. Historic and mnemonic sites from different periods, the three kingdoms, Koryo, Joseon, they ended up looking the same, losing their local, unique, and authentic traits. This standardization only shows that the commodification of heritage for tourist consumption was of secondary concern. They didn't care whether the tourists would find these places authentic enough or not. Rather, the goal of the government was to convey a coherent image of what Korean tradition was and to popularize a sense of readily recognizable Koreanness. And for reasons of time, I will stop here. Thank you very much. And I would like to encourage you to write me an email if you have further questions that you cannot, for some reason, you cannot address now, or if you want to read further on this subject. Thank you.